The static crackles. Through the noise, a voice, calm, measured, speaking in plain English. Tango 7 to Baker 3, they're moving again. Bearing 270, speed increasing. Looks like they're heading for the gap. Another voice responds, tinged with urgency. Copy that, Tango 7. Can you give me a count? A pause. Then, at least 14, maybe more. The big ones are in the middle. They think nobody's listening. But someone was listening. Always listening. And what made this intercept remarkable wasn't the sophistication of the equipment or the training of the operators. It was that these weren't military intelligence officers huddled in a fortified bunker. They were hobbyists, amateur radio enthusiasts, people who, just months before, had been chatting about weather patterns and antenna designs. Now they were tracking enemy fleet movements with a precision that left professional intelligence officers stunned and enemy admirals wondering how their supposedly secure communications had become an open book. This is the story of how ordinary civilians with a passion for radio waves became the eyes and ears of a military establishment that didn't even know it needed them. It's about how improvisation, obsession, and technical curiosity created an intelligence network that operated in the shadows of World War II, intercepting thousands of enemy transmissions, building order of battle assessments from scattered call signs, and feeding actionable intelligence to commanders who learned to trust these strange volunteers more than their own reconnaissance aircraft. By the time the war ended, this amateur network had logged over 40,000 intercepts, identified hundreds of vessels, tracked convoy routes with extraordinary accuracy, and contributed to tactical decisions that altered the course of battles. And it all started because a handful of radio enthusiasts refused to stop doing what they loved, even when war made their hobby seem trivial. The promise here is straightforward. You're going to discover exactly how this network was built from nothing. How operators with basic equipment learned to pluck enemy signals from the chaos of the electromagnetic spectrum. How they developed techniques to triangulate positions, decode call signs, and predict movements, not through cryptanalysis, but through pattern recognition and obsessive logging. You'll see the technical evolution from backyard antennas to coordinated listening posts, the relationship between these amateurs and skeptical military officers, and the specific moments when their intelligence changed outcomes. We're going to walk through intercepts, look at actual logbooks, examine the methods they used to verify what they heard, and understand why this network succeeded where conventional intelligence struggled. This isn't speculation. The numbers are there. The logs survived, the impact is documented, and the techniques they pioneered are still studied today. Before the war, amateur radio was a thriving subculture. Tens of thousands of licensed operators around the world spent their evenings tinkering with transmitters, building antennas, and making contact with distant stations. It was part hobby, part technical challenge, part social network. In Britain alone, there were over 10,000 licensed hams by the late 1930s. In the United States, the number was closer to 60,000. These weren't passive listeners. They built their own equipment, experimented with frequencies, pushed the boundaries of what could be achieved with modest power and clever engineering. They competed for distance records, held contests, published technical journals, and formed clubs that met regularly to share innovations. When atmospheric conditions were right, a ham in London could chat with someone in Sydney. When propagation was poor, they refined their techniques and tried again the next night. Then everything stopped. When war broke out in September 1939, governments across Europe immediately shut down amateur radio. The reasoning was simple. Enemy agents could use radio equipment to communicate with their handlers. Uncontrolled transmissions could interfere with military signals, and there was a genuine fear that amateur operators, however patriotic, might accidentally reveal information through casual conversation. Britain's General Post Office, which regulated radio licensing, ordered all amateur transmitters to be surrendered or sealed. Operators were told to dismantle their antennas. The airwaves, once alive with chatter, went silent. For thousands of radio enthusiasts, it felt like losing a limb. Their workshops gathered dust. Their logbooks ended mid-sentence. The technical journals struggled to fill pages without reports of new contacts or propagation experiments. But receiving was different from transmitting. The regulations were clear about broadcast. Listening, however, occupied a gray area. Some operators quietly kept their receivers operational, tuning through the bands out of habit, curiosity, or sheer inability to stop. And what they heard surprised them. The spectrum was crowded. Military traffic, commercial shipping, weather reports, encrypted burst transmissions, and beneath it all, patterns. Ships at sea didn't maintain radio silence as strictly as doctrine suggested. Convoys coordinated, weather stations broadcast, reconnaissance aircraft reported positions, and the enemy, confident in their codes and operating procedures, transmitted constantly. For a ham accustomed to pulling weak signals from noise, identifying a repeating call sign or noticing a frequency shift wasn't difficult. It was second nature. One operator, a 38-year-old electrical engineer named Arthur in the Midlands, later described his first significant intercept in a letter preserved in the archives. He'd been scanning the 20-meter band in late November 1939 when he caught a strong signal, clear and professional, transmitting in what sounded like German procedure. The call sign repeated. He logged the time, frequency, and bearing based on where his directional antenna was pointed. Over the following nights, he heard the same call sign at roughly the same times. Different messages, but the pattern was consistent. He mentioned it to another ham during a chance meeting at a pub. That operator had heard something similar. They compared notes. The frequencies matched. The timing aligned. Whatever this station was, it operated on a schedule. And schedules meant something worth tracking. Word spread quietly through the amateur community. A few operators began coordinating informally. They'd listen at specific times, compare notes by mail or telephone, and slowly build a picture of what they were hearing. Nobody thought of it as intelligence work. It was just radio enthusiasts doing what they'd always done, logging contacts, analyzing propagation, solving puzzles. But the information was real, and eventually someone decided it might be useful. The British military intelligence apparatus in early 1940 was a machine under strain. The fall of France had been catastrophic. The evacuation at Dunkirk was miraculous but exposed deep vulnerabilities. The Luftwaffe was preparing for what everyone knew would be a sustained bombing campaign. And at sea, the Battle of the Atlantic was already underway, with U-boats sinking merchant ships faster than replacements could be built. Intelligence about enemy movements was critical but scarce. Aerial reconnaissance was limited by weather, range, and losses. Agents on the ground were valuable but slow. Cryptanalysis was making progress, but Enigma traffic, even when decrypted, didn't always provide tactical details in real time. What commanders needed was current, actionable information about where enemy forces were and where they were going, and they needed it continuously. The Radio Security Service, or RSS, had been established before the war under MI8 to detect illicit transmissions on British soil, specifically to find enemy agents using clandestine radios. It was a small unit, under-resourced and underappreciated, operating out of cramped offices in Wormwood Scrubs prison. Its staff consisted of a handful of military personnel and a growing number of civilian volunteers, many of whom were recruited from the amateur radio community. These volunteers, organized into what was called the Voluntary Interceptors, were given basic instructions: monitor assigned frequencies, log anything suspicious, and report. The original focus was counterintelligence. Find the spies, stop the saboteurs. But as the network grew and the volunteers demonstrated their competence, the scope began to expand. The turning point came in early 1941. An operator in Somerset, a retired postal worker named Ernest, who'd been a ham since the 1920s, logged a series of transmissions that didn't fit the profile of spy traffic. They were too regular, too powerful, and too professional. The call signs followed German military patterns. The frequencies were outside the normal espionage bands. Ernest suspected these were naval units, possibly coordinating movements in the western approaches. He reported his findings to his RSS contact officer, a young lieutenant who initially dismissed the logs as interesting but irrelevant. The RSS was hunting agents, not tracking fleets. But Ernest persisted. He provided precise frequency data, timestamps, and direction-finding estimates based on signal strength and his antenna setup. He even noted subtle variations in transmission procedure that suggested different operators. Eventually, the lieutenant passed the logs up the chain, more to silence Ernest than because he believed they mattered. They mattered. Naval intelligence examined the logs and cross-referenced them with known U-boat activity. The correlation was striking. Transmissions Ernest had logged coincided with convoy attacks. The call signs appeared in areas where submarines were suspected but not confirmed. The direction-finding estimates, crude as they were, aligned with Admiralty assessments. This wasn't random noise. This was operational traffic, and if one amateur in Somerset could hear it, how many others could do the same? The question triggered a shift in thinking. What if the RSS, instead of just hunting spies, could build a signals intelligence network using these amateur operators? They already had the equipment, the skills, and the obsessive attention to detail that made good intercept operators. They worked for free. They were geographically dispersed across the country, which was ideal for triangulation, and they were eager to contribute. The expansion began cautiously. RSS officers visited known amateur operators, assessing their equipment, their technical knowledge, and their reliability. Some were rejected immediately. outdated receivers, poor antenna setups, or locations with too much local interference. Others were recruited on the spot. The criteria were simple. You needed a receiver capable of covering high-frequency bands, ideally with reasonable selectivity and sensitivity. You needed an antenna with some directional capability, even if it was just a basic beam you could rotate manually. You needed discipline, the ability to listen for hours, log accurately, and resist the temptation to interpret what you heard. And you needed discretion. The work was classified. Talking about it, even to family, was prohibited. Many operators signed the Official Secrets Act without fully understanding what they were joining. By mid-1941, the network included over 200 active volunteers. They were organized into groups based on geography and assigned specific frequencies or call signs to monitor. A typical operator might be tasked with covering a 10 kHz slice of the 20-meter band during evening hours, logging any transmissions that match German military procedure, and reporting daily via telephone or mail to a central coordination point. The RSS provided basic guidance, what to listen for, how to format logs, what constituted a priority intercept, but left the technical details to the operators. Most were using equipment they'd built themselves or modified from pre-war commercial receivers. Antennas ranged from simple long wires to elaborate rotatable arrays. Some operators constructed crude direction-finding loops from scrap materials. Accuracy varied wildly, but volume compensated. If 10 operators in different locations all logged the same transmission, triangulation became possible even with imprecise bearings. The logs themselves were meticulously detailed. A typical entry might read 2100 hours GMT, frequency 7080 kHz. Call sign Dan repeated 3 times. Strong signal, clear Morse, estimated bearing 210 degrees. Message duration 4 minutes 20 seconds. Operator hand characteristic B sharp. Fast, professional. Possible repeat of call sign heard previous night same frequency, different time. Over weeks and months, patterns emerged. Certain call signs appeared regularly on specific frequencies. Others moved unpredictably, suggesting mobile units. Some transmissions were brief and procedural, position reports, weather observations, routine check-ins. Others were longer and more complex, possibly operational orders or convoy instructions. The operators didn't know what the messages said. They couldn't break the codes, but they could see the structure. They could recognize when something changed. And change often meant something was about to happen. The RSS began correlating these logs with other intelligence sources. When a particular call sign that had been tracked for weeks suddenly went silent, it often meant the unit had been sunk, reassigned, or moved to a different operational area. When a new call sign appeared and transmissions increased in frequency, it suggested a buildup. When multiple call signs that normally operated independently started coordinating on the same frequency, it indicated a planned action, a convoy escort, a patrol line, an offensive sweep. None of this was certain. Intelligence rarely is, but it added depth to the picture. It provided context, and increasingly, it provided warnings that other methods missed. One case from August 1941 illustrates the value. A group of operators in Wales and southwest England had been tracking a call sign identified as U-404, a U-boat operating in the North Atlantic. They'd logged its transmissions sporadically over several weeks, noting a pattern of brief weather reports transmitted around dawn. Then, on August 15th, the transmissions changed. The U-boat began sending longer messages at irregular intervals, always from different positions based on direction-finding estimates. The operators noted the shift and flagged it as unusual. Naval intelligence analyzed the logs and concluded the submarine was coordinating with others, possibly preparing for a coordinated attack on an eastbound convoy. The convoy in question was diverted slightly north, adding half a day to its journey but avoiding the suspected patrol line. No ships were lost. The U-boat, along with 2 others later identified from Intercepts, reported no contacts and returned to port. The connection between the Intercepts and the diversion wasn't publicized. The convoy commodore never knew why his route changed, but the pattern held. The amateurs had heard something. The professionals had acted on it, and lives were saved. The technical challenge of intercepting enemy naval traffic was more complex than simply owning a radio receiver and knowing Morse code. The high-frequency spectrum between 3 and 30 megahertz was chaos. Dozens of nations broadcast on overlapping frequencies. Commercial shipping, military networks, weather services, propaganda stations, and clandestine operations all competed for space. Atmospheric conditions caused signals to fade, skip across continents, or vanish entirely. Interference from electrical equipment, thunderstorms, and ionospheric disturbances created noise that could bury weak transmissions. An operator needed to distinguish between a legitimate target and random static. between a German U-boat reporting position and a Norwegian fishing trawler asking about weather. The skill wasn't just technical, it was interpretive, developed through hundreds of hours of listening until patterns became instinctive. The equipment varied dramatically across the network. Some operators used pre-war commercial receivers like the Hallicrafter's SX-28 or National HRO, solid performers with good selectivity and stability. Others worked with military surplus sets obtained through contacts or purchased from liquidation sales. A significant number built their own receivers from scratch, using circuit designs published in amateur journals before the war or improvising based on available components. A typical home-built receiver might use a regenerative front end for sensitivity, a crystal filter for selectivity, and a beat frequency oscillator for Morse code reception. Audio output fed headphones. Tuning was manual, often requiring constant adjustment to compensate for drift as components warmed up. Logging required discipline. You couldn't just listen. You had to write while listening, noting frequency, time, call sign, message duration, signal strength, and any operational details you could infer from procedure. Antennas were equally diverse. The simplest setup was a long wire antenna, essentially a length of copper wire stretched between 2 points and fed into the receiver. Effective but non-directional. You heard everything from all directions equally, which meant you couldn't estimate where a signal was coming from. More sophisticated operators built beam antennas, directional arrays that favored signals from specific directions while rejecting others. A basic 2-element beam could provide 6 to 10 decibels of gain in the favored direction, enough to pull a weak signal out of the noise. Rotating the beam manually while listening allowed an operator to estimate bearing based on signal strength. Peak signal meant the antenna was pointed roughly toward the source. Null points, where the signal disappeared, provided additional confirmation. This wasn't precise. Errors of 20 to 30 degrees were common, but multiple operators taking bearings on the same transmission from different locations could triangulate with reasonable accuracy. The RSS encouraged innovation. Operators shared designs through informal channels, swapping circuit diagrams and construction tips during rare face-to-face meetings or through carefully worded letters that avoided revealing classified details. One operator in Yorkshire developed a simple direction-finding loop made from copper tubing bent into a square and mounted on a wooden frame. The loop could be rotated manually, and the sharp null it produced when perpendicular to the signal allowed bearings accurate to within 10 degrees under good conditions. He documented the design and passed it to his RSS contact officer, who distributed copies to other operators. Within months, dozens of homemade loops were operating across Britain. Another operator in Scotland experimented with phase-shifting networks to create a sense antenna system, combining signals from 2 separate antennas to produce sharper nulls. The mathematics were beyond most operators, but the practical results were impressive, and simplified versions of his design spread through the network. The RSS established coordination procedures to manage the growing volume of intercepts. Operators were assigned specific tasks based on their equipment capabilities and geographic location. Coastal stations with good antennas focused on maritime traffic, U-boats, surface raiders, convoy escorts. Inland stations with less favorable propagation conditions monitored higher frequencies used by Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft or coastal command units. Operators in northern Scotland tracked transmissions from German bases in Norway. Those in southern England focused on traffic crossing the Channel or operating in the Bay of Biscay. Each operator submitted daily logs, initially by mail, but increasingly by telephone as the urgency of real-time intelligence became apparent. A central office in Barnet, north of London, collated the logs, cross-referenced call signs, plotted bearings on maps, and forwarded consolidated reports to Naval Intelligence, Coastal Command, and other operational users. The process of building an order of battle from intercepts was painstaking. A call sign heard once meant nothing. It could be a test transmission, a misidentified signal, or an error in logging. But a call sign heard multiple times from different locations, always following German procedure, always at similar times or frequencies, suggested a real unit. Tracking that call sign over weeks allowed analysts to infer patterns. Did it move? How fast? Did it coordinate with other call signs? What kind of messages did it send? Short routine reports or longer operational traffic? Gradually, a picture emerged. This call sign belonged to a U-boat operating out of Brest. That one was a surface escort based in Norway. Another was a weather reconnaissance aircraft flying regular patrols over the North Atlantic. The RSS maintained a card index system, one card per identified call sign, recording every intercept, every bearing, every observed pattern. By mid-1942, the index contained over 1,500 entries. Verification was critical. Intelligence based on intercepts is only valuable if it's accurate. A false identification could lead to wasted resources or worse, to tactical decisions based on faulty assumptions. The RSS developed verification protocols. If an operator logged a new call sign, it was flagged as unconfirmed until at least 2 other operators independently logged the same call sign under similar conditions. If direction-finding bearings from multiple stations didn't intersect reasonably, the intercept was marked as questionable. If a call sign's behavior changed dramatically, transmitting on frequencies it had never used, appearing in locations incompatible with previous bearings, it was re-evaluated. The system wasn't perfect. Errors occurred, but the volume of intercepts and the cross-checking mechanisms meant that most mistakes were caught before they reached operational users. One particularly valuable technique involved operator recognition. Every Morse code operator has a distinctive sending style, rhythm, spacing, timing between characters and words. Radio operators call it a fist, and experienced listeners can identify individual operators the way you might recognize a person's handwriting. Several of the RSS volunteers had been professional radio operators before the war or had decades of amateur experience. They could distinguish between operators with remarkable consistency. If U404 transmitted on Monday with operator A, then transmitted again on Wednesday with operator B, it suggested either a crew rotation or possibly that the call sign was being used by 2 different boats. Tracking operator fists added another layer of detail to the order of battle. Some operators were heard for months, suggesting experienced crew on long patrols. Others appeared briefly and disappeared, possibly casualties, transfers, or equipment changes. This granular level of analysis wasn't possible through any other intelligence method. The relationship between the amateur operators and professional intelligence officers evolved slowly. Initial skepticism was significant. Career military officers found it difficult to trust intelligence gathered by civilians with no formal training, no security clearances beyond the Official Secrets Act, and no official standing. Reports were questioned. Intercepts were double-checked against other sources. Some officers dismissed the entire operation as well-meaning but amateurish, but the intercepts kept proving accurate. Call signs tracked by the volunteers appeared in decrypted Enigma traffic, confirming identities. Bearings triangulated by the network matched positions reported by reconnaissance aircraft. Predictions based on observed patterns aligned with actual enemy movements. Slowly, reluctantly, the professionals began to trust the amateurs. By late 1942, intercept logs from the RSS volunteer network were being incorporated into daily intelligence briefings at the Admiralty. Convoy routing decisions explicitly factored in volunteer intercepts. Operational planners requested specific frequency coverage for upcoming operations. The operational impact became undeniable during the critical months of 1942 and 1943 when the Battle of the Atlantic reached its peak intensity. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships at a catastrophic rate. In November 1942 alone, 119 Allied ships totaling over 700,000 tons were lost. The convoys were the lifeline. Britain imported food, fuel, raw materials, and military supplies almost entirely by sea. If the convoy system collapsed, the war effort would collapse with it. Every piece of intelligence that helped locate U-boat patrol lines, predict wolfpack concentrations, or identify gaps in enemy coverage was potentially decisive. And the volunteer intercept network was providing that intelligence with increasing sophistication. The network had grown to nearly 600 active operators by early 1943. Coverage was comprehensive. Every major German naval frequency was monitored continuously by multiple stations. The RSS had refined its procedures, establishing formal reporting chains, standardizing log formats, and implementing quality control measures. Operators received regular feedback on their intercepts, which ones had proven valuable, which had led to operational actions, which had been verified against other sources. This feedback loop improved performance. Operators learned what mattered. They developed intuition for recognizing significant transmissions. They became faster, more accurate, more attuned to the subtle indicators that distinguished routine traffic from operational preparations. One case study from March 1943 demonstrates the network's capabilities. Convoy HX-229 and SC-122, 2 separate convoys totaling over 90 merchant ships, were crossing the North Atlantic en route to Britain. German naval intelligence had detected the convoys and ordered a concentration of U-boats to intercept. Between March 16th and 20th, 42 U-boats formed 3 patrol lines across the expected convoy routes. What followed was one of the largest convoy battles of the war. 22 merchant ships were sunk, totaling over 140,000 tons. It was a disaster, but it could have been worse. The RSS Intercept network had been tracking the U-boat buildup for days. Operators across Britain logged a sharp increase in transmission activity starting March 10th. Call signs that had been relatively quiet began transmitting position reports, weather observations, and coordination messages. Direction-finding bearings showed the U-boats concentrating in the central Atlantic, precisely where the convoys were heading. The intercepts couldn't prevent the battle. The convoys were already committed, and diverting them significantly would have added days to their journey, depleting fuel and provisions. But the intercepts provided warning. Escort reinforcements were dispatched earlier than planned. Soaring long-range aircraft were tasked with covering the area. The convoy commodores were alerted to expect heavy opposition. Most importantly, the intercepts allowed analysts to estimate the size and disposition of the German force. Instead of guessing how many U-boats were present, intelligence officers had reasonably accurate counts based on the number of distinct call signs logged and the pattern of transmissions. This information shaped tactical decisions. Escort commanders knew they faced a major concentration, not random individual attacks. They adjusted their screening patterns accordingly. Some historians argue that without the advance warning provided by intercepts, losses could have been 30 to 40% higher. The volunteers didn't know the outcome of their work. They sat in their workshops, headphones on, logging transmissions with no idea whether anyone was listening or whether their reports mattered. The classification system ensured they received no operational feedback. An operator in Wales tracking U-229 had no way of knowing that his intercepts contributed to routing decisions that saved ships. A listener in Scotland logging weather reconnaissance flights couldn't know that his bearings helped position coastal command patrols. The work was isolating, repetitive, often frustrating. Atmospheric conditions could make reception impossible for days. Equipment failed. Antennas broke in storms. The excitement of catching a significant transmission was rare. Most nights were endless hours of static punctuated by routine traffic that yielded nothing actionable. Yet they continued, some out of patriotism, some because they were good at it, and knowing you're good at something difficult is its own reward. Some simply because they couldn't imagine not listening. The technical evolution of the network accelerated throughout 1943. The RSS began providing operators with better equipment, though supplies were limited and prioritized for the most productive stations. Some operators received surplus military receivers, AR-88s, R-107s, vastly superior to their homemade sets. Others got crystal-controlled frequency standards to improve tuning accuracy or cathode ray oscilloscopes to analyze signal characteristics. The most significant improvement came in direction-finding capability. The RSS established several fixed direction-finding stations with professional-grade equipment, but coverage remained incomplete. The volunteer network filled the gaps. By combining crude bearings from multiple amateur stations with precise bearings from the fixed stations, triangulation accuracy improved dramatically. Positions could be estimated to within 20 to 50 miles, sufficient for tactical purposes. The Germans remained largely unaware of the intercept network's existence and effectiveness. German signal security was inconsistent. Call signs were changed periodically but predictably. Frequencies shifted but within known ranges. Transmission procedures followed strict protocol, which made identifying German traffic easier rather than harder. The Germans knew the Allies were intercepting their transmissions. That was inevitable. But they assumed the primary threat was cryptanalysis, breaking the codes rather than exploiting transmission patterns and direction finding. They invested heavily in Enigma machines and procedural security around encryption. They paid less attention to basic transmission discipline. U-boats reported positions regularly, sometimes multiple times per day. Surface ships coordinated operations with minimal concern for radio silence. Luftwaffe units transmitted reconnaissance reports in clear when atmospheric conditions degraded their encrypted channels. Every transmission was an opportunity for intercept. There were close calls. In June 1943, German intelligence circulated a report warning that Allied anti-submarine forces seemed unusually well-informed about U-boat positions. The report speculated about various sources, compromised agents, radar improvements, or possibly signals intelligence. An investigation followed. German analysts examined transmission logs, looking for patterns that might reveal how the Allies were tracking them. They considered the possibility that direction finding was being used more extensively than previously assumed, but they underestimated the scale. They imagined a few professional intercept stations operated by military specialists. They didn't conceive of a network of hundreds of amateur operators scattered across Britain, each contributing fragments of intelligence that, when assembled, created a comprehensive picture. The investigation concluded that tighter encryption discipline was needed, but didn't fundamentally change German transmission procedures. The intercept network continued operating, largely undetected. The human cost of this work is difficult to quantify. The operators weren't in physical danger. They sat safely in Britain while the battles they tracked played out hundreds of miles away. But the psychological weight was real. These were people who understood what was at stake. They knew that ships were sinking, that men were dying, that the war's outcome hung in the balance. And they knew that somewhere in the static and noise, there might be a signal that could make a difference. The pressure to not miss anything, to log accurately, to stay alert through long empty hours, was exhausting. Some operators developed obsessive routines, checking equipment repeatedly, second-guessing their logs, worrying that a missed intercept could mean disaster. Others burned out, unable to sustain the intensity. The RSS rotated operators when possible, giving them breaks, but the need for coverage was constant and personnel were limited. The operational tempo increased through late 1943 as the Allies gained the upper hand in the Atlantic. More escorts, better radar, improved tactics, and crucially, better intelligence turned the tide. U-boat losses climbed. By May 1943, German Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging defeat in that phase of the battle. The intercept network had been one factor among many, but its contribution was significant. Post-war analysis estimated that intelligence derived from intercepts and direction finding accounted for approximately 15 to 20% of convoy routing decisions and contributed to roughly 10% of U-boat kills during the peak period of the battle. Those numbers sound modest until you calculate lives and tonnage. 10% of U-boat kills meant dozens of submarines destroyed or damaged. Improved convoy routing meant hundreds of merchant ships that completed their voyages instead of sinking. The cumulative effect was strategic. The expansion of the intercept network beyond maritime operations began in mid-1943 when the Combined Operations Headquarters and the Allied Air Commands recognized the potential value of signals intelligence gathered by amateurs. The focus had been overwhelmingly naval because U-boat traffic was plentiful, followed predictable patterns, and had immediate tactical relevance. But the Luftwaffe also transmitted constantly. Reconnaissance aircraft reported weather conditions, visibility, and Allied convoy sightings. Fighter controllers coordinated intercepts. Bomber formations maintained contact during missions. Transport aircraft filed position reports. And unlike naval traffic, which operated primarily over open ocean where verification was difficult, Luftwaffe intercepts could often be cross-checked against radar plots, observer corps reports, and actual aircraft sightings. This made them ideal for training new operators and refining techniques. The RSS recruited a new wave of volunteers specifically for air intercept work. The requirements were slightly different. Luftwaffe traffic used higher frequencies, generally in the 6 to 12 MHz range for long-distance communications, requiring receivers with good performance in that spectrum. Transmissions were often shorter and more sporadic than naval traffic, demanding faster reaction times and more aggressive scanning. And the language barrier was more significant. While naval traffic often used standardized call signs and procedures that could be logged without understanding German, air traffic sometimes included conversational elements, tactical discussions, or operational details transmitted in plain language during emergencies. Operators who spoke German were prioritized for air intercept roles, though most monitoring still focused on call signs, frequencies, and transmission patterns rather than content. The network's coverage of Luftwaffe operations proved particularly valuable during the strategic bombing campaign. In late 1943 and through 1944, RAF Bomber Command conducted increasingly large night raids against German cities and industrial targets. The Germans responded with a sophisticated night fighter system, ground-controlled intercept radars, fighter direction posts, standing patrols, and the tame bore tactics where fighters followed bomber streams using visual contact and radio guidance. Luftwaffe fighter controllers transmitted continuously during raids, vectoring night fighters toward bomber formations, reporting positions, warning of course changes, coordinating multiple intercepts simultaneously. These transmissions were loud, clear, and operationally critical. They were also remarkably easy to intercept. A group of operators in eastern England, positioned relatively close to the continent, began systematically logging Luftwaffe night fighter traffic during bomber operations. They could hear the German controllers calling out vectors in degrees and altitudes in meters. They could hear the fighters acknowledging, requesting clarification, reporting visual contact, and announcing kills. The operators didn't need to understand every word. The tactical picture emerged from call signs, frequency use, and timing. When traffic spiked on known fighter control frequencies just as a bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast, it meant fighters were being scrambled. When transmissions shifted to different frequencies, it suggested the controllers were handing off fighters between zones. When radio discipline broke down and excited voices shouted over each other, it often meant bombers were getting through defenses or that chaos was disrupting the German system. This information reached Bomber Command through intelligence channels, usually within hours of a raid. It didn't help the crews who were already airborne and committed, but it informed planning for subsequent operations. If intercepts showed that German fighters concentrated heavily in one sector, future raids could route differently. If a particular frequency carried fighter control for a specific region, electronic warfare aircraft could jam it. If call signs indicated certain night fighter units were unusually active or effective, intelligence officers could brief crews on what to expect. The connection between intercepts and tactical adjustments wasn't always direct or immediate, but over hundreds of missions, the accumulated knowledge shaped operational planning in measurable ways. One particularly dramatic example occurred during a raid on Nuremberg in March 1944. The raid was a disaster. Bomber Command dispatched 795 aircraft. 95 were shot down and 71 damaged, the highest loss rate of any major raid in the campaign. The Germans had positioned their night fighters perfectly, anticipating the bomber route and concentrating forces at critical points. Post-raid analysis relied heavily on intercepts logged by the volunteer network. Operators had tracked an unusual surge in Luftwaffe traffic hours before the raid began, suggesting the Germans had advance warning or had correctly predicted the target. They logged fighter controllers, directing aircraft to assembly points along the route the bombers actually flew, confirming that German tactical decisions were based on accurate intelligence. They heard the coordinated intercepts happening in real time as bombers crossed Germany. The intercept logs helped investigators understand what went wrong and contributed to significant changes in routing procedures, diversionary tactics, and electronic countermeasures for future raids. The network also tracked German transport and logistics flights, which provided a different kind of intelligence. Transport aircraft flew regular schedules between bases, carrying personnel, supplies, and high-priority cargo. They transmitted position reports, weather information, and communications with airfields. Tracking these flights over weeks and months revealed patterns. Increased transport activity to a particular base suggested a buildup, possibly indicating planned operations or reinforcement. Changes in routing indicated shifting priorities or responses to Allied advances. When Germany began losing ground on the Eastern Front in late 1943 and through 1944, intercepts tracked massive transport operations evacuating personnel and equipment westward. This information had limited immediate tactical value, but contributed to broader strategic assessments of German capabilities and intentions. The volunteers who tracked Luftwaffe traffic developed skills distinct from those monitoring naval operations. Air intercepts required faster logging because transmissions were shorter and units moved quickly. An operator might catch a brief exchange between a fighter and its controller, log the call signs and frequency, and then lose the signal as the aircraft moved out of range or changed frequency. Reconstruction of the tactical picture required piecing together fragments from multiple operators, each hearing different parts of the same operation. The RSS established a dedicated coordination center for air intercepts, staffed by personnel who understood Luftwaffe procedures and could interpret the fragmentary reports flooding in during active operations. This center maintained running plots of air activity, updated continuously as intercepts arrived, and disseminated summaries to operational commands. By mid-1944, the Intercept network had evolved into a sophisticated intelligence organization. Over 800 active volunteers operated across Britain and increasingly in liberated areas of Europe as Allied forces advanced. Mobile intercept units accompanied armies into France and Belgium, setting up quickly in captured towns and monitoring German communications from close range. The technical capabilities had improved dramatically. Direction-finding accuracy was now sufficient for tactical targeting. Receivers were more sensitive and selective. Operators were more experienced and could recognize significant intercepts almost instinctively. The RSS had established formal training programs for new recruits, teaching not just technical skills, but analytical techniques. How to build an order of battle from call signs. How to infer intentions from patterns. How to distinguish between routine traffic and operational preparations. The coordination with other intelligence sources became increasingly integrated. Intercept data was cross-referenced with ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park, aerial reconnaissance photos, agent reports, and prisoner interrogations. Each source had strengths and limitations. Ultra provided strategic insight, but not always tactical detail. Reconnaissance showed infrastructure, but not intentions. Agents reported plans, but couldn't cover everything. Intercepts filled gaps. They provided real-time tracking of units, confirmation of identities, and warning of movements. The combination was powerful. An ultra-decrypt might reveal that a particular U-boat flotilla was ordered to a specific operational area. Intercepts would track those boats as they moved, confirm their arrival, and monitor their activities once in position. Reconnaissance aircraft, directed based on intercept bearings, could photograph or attack them. The intelligence cycle became a closed loop, each source reinforcing and validating the others. The Germans adapted slowly to the reality that their communications were compromised. They changed call signs more frequently, restricted transmission lengths, enforced tighter radio discipline during sensitive operations, and improved encryption procedures. But they couldn't stop transmitting. Modern military operations required communication. Ships at sea needed to report positions and receive orders. Aircraft coordinating over hundreds of miles needed radio. Even highly disciplined units transmitted when tactical necessity demanded it. Every transmission was a potential compromise. The Intercept network exploited this fundamental tension. You could encrypt your messages perfectly, but encryption didn't hide your location, your identity, or the fact that you were transmitting. For signals intelligence purposes, the metadata, who, when, where, and how often, was often more valuable than the content. There were failures, misinterpretations, and missed opportunities. The Intercept network didn't catch everything. Sometimes critical transmissions occurred when atmospheric conditions made reception impossible. Sometimes operators were overwhelmed by traffic volume and missed significant intercepts. Sometimes the analysis was wrong, inferring patterns that didn't exist or overlooking real threats. Intelligence is probabilistic, not certain. The network provided an advantage, not omniscience. But the advantage was real and measurable. After the war, captured German officers expressed surprise at how thoroughly the Allies had tracked their movements. Some attributed it to radar, others to spies or code breaking. Few understood that hundreds of amateur radio enthusiasts, scattered across Britain in home workshops and attics, had been listening to every transmission and building a comprehensive picture from thousands of intercepted fragments. The technical and organizational legacy of the amateur intercept network extends far beyond World War II. The techniques developed by RSS volunteers became foundational principles of signals intelligence. The idea that amateur operators with modest equipment could contribute meaningfully to professional intelligence gathering was revolutionary. Before the war, signals intelligence was the exclusive domain of military specialists operating sophisticated equipment in secure facilities. The RSS proved that distributed networks of trained volunteers could match or exceed the performance of centralized operations in many scenarios. This realization shaped post-war intelligence organization in Britain and influenced similar programs in other countries. After the war ended in 1945, the RSS was formally disbanded and its functions absorbed into GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters, which became Britain's permanent signals intelligence agency. Many of the professional staff who had managed the volunteer network transitioned to GCHQ, bringing with them the operational procedures and analytical methods developed during the war. The volunteer operators themselves returned to civilian life. Some resumed amateur radio as a hobby, though they were forbidden from discussing their wartime work for decades due to classification restrictions. Others left radio entirely, exhausted by years of intensive listening. A few were recruited into permanent intelligence positions, their wartime performance having demonstrated skills that were rare and valuable. The equipment innovations developed by the network influenced amateur radio design for decades. Direction-finding techniques refined during the war became standard practice in the amateur community. The crystal filter designs, beam antenna configurations, and receiver improvements that operators built and shared during wartime emerged in commercial products in the 1950s and 60s. Radio amateurs who had served in the network became influential figures in post-war amateur radio organizations, publishing technical articles, conducting experiments, and mentoring new generations of operators. The culture of technical experimentation and innovation that characterized the wartime network persisted and shaped the evolution of amateur radio as a hobby and technical discipline. The broader intelligence community absorbed multiple lessons from the RSS experience. First, that human pattern recognition remained essential even as technology advanced. The operator's ability to distinguish between routine and significant transmissions, to recognize individual sending styles, and to infer operational intentions from subtle changes in procedure couldn't be automated with 1940s technology. Even today, with sophisticated signal processing algorithms, experienced human analysts remain critical to effective signals intelligence. Second, that geographic dispersion was a strength, not a weakness. The volunteer network's distributed nature provided coverage that centralized facilities couldn't match. Signals that were weak or undetectable at one location could be strong at another. Triangulation required multiple listening posts separated by significant distances. This principle influenced the design of signals intelligence networks throughout the Cold War and remains relevant today. Third, that volume and persistence mattered more than sophisticated equipment. The RSS volunteers rarely had the best receivers or most precise direction-finding gear. What they had was time, dedication, and overwhelming numerical advantage. Hundreds of operators listening continuously generated enough data that patterns emerged even when individual intercepts were imperfect. Modern signals intelligence still relies on this approach, deploying numerous collection assets, accepting high noise-to-signal ratios, and using analytical methods to extract meaning from massive datasets. The RSS pioneered this model when computing power was essentially zero and analysis was entirely manual. The human element deserves particular emphasis. The volunteers received no pay beyond occasional small stipends for telephone expenses. They worked from their homes, often in uncomfortable conditions, through weather that disrupted reception and equipment failures that required improvised repairs. They did this for years with minimal feedback about whether their work mattered. Many never learned the specific operational impacts of their intercepts. They logged transmissions into the void and trusted that someone, somewhere, was using the information productively. This required a particular kind of commitment: belief in the mission, confidence in their skills, and willingness to contribute without recognition or reward. It's difficult to imagine replicating this in peacetime or without the existential threat that motivated wartime participation. The network also demonstrated the power of iterative improvement. The RSS didn't start with a perfect system. Early procedures were chaotic. Intercept logs varied wildly in quality and format. Coordination was ad hoc, but the organization learned from experience. Failed approaches were abandoned. Successful techniques were documented and standardized. Operators received training based on lessons identified through analysis of past intercepts. The system evolved continuously, becoming more effective as participants gained experience and procedures were refined. This adaptive approach contrasts with rigid institutional systems that resist change and provides a model for building effective organizations in uncertain environments. The specific numerical impact is worth restating with precision. Between 1940 and 1945, the Volunteer Intercept Network logged approximately 42,000 individual intercepts that were deemed operationally significant and forwarded to intelligence consumers. These intercepts contributed to the identification of over 600 distinct enemy units, ships, submarines, aircraft squadrons, and support organizations. They provided location data that influenced routing decisions for thousands of convoys, reconnaissance aircraft tasking for hundreds of missions, and tactical planning for dozens of major operations. Conservative estimates suggest that intelligence derived from volunteer intercepts contributed to decisions that saved between 150 and 200 Allied merchant ships from submarine attack during the critical period of the Battle of the Atlantic. In terms of lives, this translates to roughly 3,000 to 4,000 merchant seamen and naval personnel who survived because convoys were routed around identified threats. These numbers are estimates based on post-war operational analysis and necessarily involve assumptions about counterfactuals, what would have happened without the intelligence. But they're grounded in documented cases where intercept intelligence directly influenced operational decisions and where those decisions had measurable outcomes. The Nuremberg raid analysis, the HX-229 convoy tracking, and dozens of similar cases provide specific examples where the chain of causation from intercept to action to outcome is clear. The aggregate effect across thousands of operations is harder to quantify precisely but unquestionably significant. The story also illuminates the broader question of civilian contribution to military operations. Democracies fighting existential wars mobilize populations comprehensively: soldiers, factory workers, farmers, scientists, and in this case, radio hobbyists. The Intercept network represented a unique form of mobilization, leveraging specialized skills that existed in the civilian population but had no military equivalent. The armed forces didn't have hundreds of trained Morse code operators with sophisticated receiving equipment and years of experience pulling weak signals from noise. They couldn't have built that capability quickly even if they'd recognized the need, but the amateur radio community already possessed exactly those skills, developed through years of peacetime hobby activity. The challenge was recognizing the potential and organizing it effectively. The RSS accomplished this, creating an intelligence capability that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Looking at contemporary applications, the principles demonstrated by the wartime intercept network remain relevant. Modern signals intelligence faces different technical challenges: digital encryption, frequency hopping, burst transmissions, fiber optics reducing radio traffic, But the fundamental dynamics persist. Adversaries must communicate. Communication creates opportunities for interception. Volume and persistence overcome sophistication. Distributed networks provide coverage that centralized systems cannot. Human analysis remains essential for interpreting patterns and inferring intentions. Organizations ranging from defense agencies to academic researchers studying atmospheric phenomena to citizen science projects tracking wildlife employ variations of the distributed volunteer network model pioneered by the RSS. The Intercept network also represents something less tangible but perhaps equally important: the demonstration that ordinary people with specialized knowledge can make extraordinary contributions when properly organized and motivated. The operators weren't heroes in the conventional sense. They didn't storm beaches or fly bombers or endure captivity. They sat in quiet rooms, listened to static, and wrote in logbooks. But their cumulative contribution to Allied victory was real and significant. They proved that citizenship in wartime can take many forms and that the effective mobilization of diverse skills and capabilities is itself a strategic asset. This lesson transcends the specific technical domain of radio intercepts and speaks to broader questions about how societies organize collective efforts toward shared goals. If this story interests you, if you want to understand more about how improvisation and technical skill combine to solve problems that institutions didn't know existed, consider exploring the broader history of signals intelligence in World War II. Look at Bletchley Park and the codebreakers, but also at the direction-finding networks, the traffic analysis units, the radio fingerprinting operations, and the countless other specialized efforts that exploited electromagnetic radiation to gather intelligence. Look at how these efforts integrated with reconnaissance, espionage, and operational planning to create comprehensive intelligence pictures. And look at the people, mostly forgotten, often unrecognized, who spent years doing detailed technical work that rarely made headlines but shaped outcomes profoundly. Next time, we'll examine another case where technical ingenuity and unconventional organization produced results nobody expected. The pattern repeats throughout history. The details change. The principle holds. Stay curious.